no matter what community you're from. You could be a college student, a policewoman, a fireman, or even a local business owner. No matter what your occupation is, put all those together and community is us. I'm your host, Paul Morgan, and today I have a very special guest, Annie Kountz, a Harvard University graduate from the School of Design. Welcome to the show.
Thanks. Thanks for having me.
How you doing? Now, I know you were doing a presentation on African American history, and it was basically on the crisis of African Americans and incarceration.
Yeah.
Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, so my thesis project, and I've been doing it since last fall, and I've been studying the sort of history and sociology and philosophy and architecture behind mass incarceration in the U.S. How it got started, but a large part of it has been a study of African American history and how African Americans are disproportionately imprisoned in this country.
Okay, now, do you think the justice system is fair right now as far as African Americans go?
Absolutely unfair. I mean, our whole slogan, "Justice for All," was established at the time of slavery, so I think it's never really been fair to all. There's a study by the Spatial Information Design Lab at Columbia University in New York, and they showed that there are people imprisoned in a one-block radius where they spend millions of dollars to incarcerate people on a single block, and they focus on impoverished neighborhoods and especially neighborhoods of color. Yeah.
So basically, it's more focusing and targeting the poor.
Yeah, absolutely. It targets the poor, but especially it depends on the city. But like where I'm from, there is a very small African American population, so it tends to be a lot of Hispanic people and poor white people imprisoned. But in terms of the proportion of the population represented in prison, it's completely disproportionate. So for example, when I go to visit my brother, the African American population in Washington State is maybe 5%, but probably over half of the prison population there is African American, which is really ridiculous. Or in New York State, where they have there's 7 different neighborhoods that create 80% of the prison population, and 85% of them are Black or Latino. And in neighborhoods like in Baltimore and Detroit, the numbers are even higher.
Wow.
So it's pretty bleak, yeah.
Wow. Now, is it true they took away the education out of the prisons? You know, now people can no longer educate themselves?
Yeah, well, not everywhere. I mean, I think there are still programs that exist out there, but they're cut largely. Especially in California, prisons are so overpopulated that have multi-purpose rooms or recreation rooms or classrooms that were once used for these types of programs in prison. Now they're filled with triple bunk beds full of people. So a lot of programs have been cut. There are some good prisons out there that work harder to include these things, but the overwhelming majority have nothing or don't do enough. They treat people as really disposable, and they don't invest in people while they're in prison.
Wow. I mean, some folks seem to think now that private institutions basically targeting the poor community as like cattle.
Private prisons have about 11 or 12% of the total prison population in the country, and the numbers are rising. They started in about 1980, 1983, I think. It was started by businessmen who really made it their goal to imprison as many people in their facilities as possible. It's really awful. Like the Corrections Corporation of America, CCA, one of their head businessmen said their target for their growth industry is getting youth and immigration. So they put immigrants in detention centers for doing nothing but entering this country that we've all immigrated to, and getting youth in, because when you get a youth in, A, you get them in the system, and B, they can't get out. They get stuck, and so they'll have a whole lifetime of profits from a young person. So they spend a lot of money lobbying and pushing for laws that will get people imprisoned, because they make money based on the number of beds they have filled.
Wow. Now, if we kind of rewind this and go backwards a little bit, I know this is African American History Month. Now, if you take a look back during the slavery time, and we can kind of like pinpoint some of the same laws that matches the laws of today.
Yeah, absolutely. There's been a lot of scholarship and literature recently that's traced the lineages of prison and sort of American zeal for punishment to the time of slavery. Michelle Alexander is a really good example. She wrote The New Jim Crow, but there's been several others, and the basic argument is that that imprisonment is a structural system that gets people to be excluded from the economy and imprisons them so that they can't do anything else, keeps them illiterate and other things. Specifically, laws from the time of slavery. When slavery was abolished with the 13th Amendment, there was a caveat to this that said slavery was still legal for criminals, and so they basically just made a new name for the same thing, where through convict leasing and parchment farms and these kinds of things, they could imprison black people for doing nothing but whatever their law was. Like you looked at someone incorrectly, or you were out after curfew, or anything, and then they put people in essentially slave farms, but then put them in a convict uniform. Like we've all seen pictures of the chain gangs and things like that. Louisiana State Penitentiary, for example, still runs as a cotton plantation, as it did in the times before the Civil War. Yeah, there's a lot of literature that I'd recommend for anyone interested at the type of history of how this developed.
And then, like I said, if you take another look back during slavery, there was always a broken home, almost like the same as today.
Absolutely. I forget the exact number, but I want to say like 50 to 60% of men in prison have children, and we're the primary financial provider. There are over 8.7 million children with parents incarcerated, and it's much more disproportionate for African American children. It's about 10% of African American children have a father incarcerated in this country. And most people who are in prison are from fatherless families. It's a generational
like a cycle.
problem. Exactly. And nothing. The prison system says it's for rehabilitation and things like this, but we don't actually invest in anything that would improve people's prospect or try to do something to reverse this cycle. Instead, it just continues, and prisons actually make people who were non-violent violent. And once it gets them in, it makes it very, very difficult for people to get out, and 70% end up going back to prison within 3 years. So yeah.
And this also affects a lot of them with the ability to get a job or to even take care of their family once they get out. Only because they're not able to be educated anymore. Like back in the days, there were like facilities where they actually take up training, get their GED. But now it's just like you said, they basically don't want them to be able to do anything. So how can you get out of prison after doing like 10 years and you can't even read an application?
Exactly.
You know what I'm saying?
It's a major problem. Like 70% of prisoners are functionally illiterate, and once you get out, very, like, especially with the economy doing as bad as it is today, it's difficult for anyone, but it's almost impossible for people with any kind of a record. And there are very few places that even have things like ban the box rules, which means on the application they're not allowed to screen for criminals until the end of the process. A lot of people wouldn't even consider it. Even people who have an education, they wouldn't consider it. And it's a major problem. We need to invest. It's really a loss for society, for our culture, by not allowing people to reach their potential. It has nothing to do with their ability to do things and make a life for themselves. They just haven't been given the opportunity to do so. And I think very strongly that people should be given opportunities and not locked in a cage for years. I don't think it helps, makes it much worse.
Now, speaking on the 3-strike law, that's another thing I wanted to talk about. I think the bill was too wide, you know, and mainly for the urban community.
Yeah.
Now, I know, you know, the majority of the people that are affected are African Americans, but there are poor whites, poor Latinos, and Native Americans that are also being affected too.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think they're discriminating against that either. If you don't have any money, you know, and yeah, especially in today's society.
Yeah.
I mean, what do you think could be done to, you know, maybe put a change for this thing?
Man, I think there are so many things that could and should be done with this. Personally, I think the biggest thing is that most people don't know that this exists, that this is such a problem. I think this is the most grave human rights violation of our time, and I think very, very few people even know it's a problem, because it's beyond the experience of most people, most Americans. And so people in neighborhoods where we're from, like, everyone knows someone who's in prison or something, and it affects us, but there's this shame with it, so people don't talk about it. And prisons are almost always completely dislocated from where they're affected. So people are sent thousands of miles away sometimes. And so people don't talk about it, and then the rest of the country, I think they just don't know it's happening. They don't know how grave the situation is, and I think the biggest thing people can do is make it known, make it visible to something that's invisible. It needs to be made visible to people, and then obviously there's a whole bunch of things that prisons, the very institution of prisons should be challenged, and we need to have better schools, and we need to have programs for people in prison and coming out of prison. And yeah, I mean, from policy issues to architectural issues, like what I'm doing, from just social justice and standing up for this, I think it needs to get out.
Very good.
The bottom line is this: you got to pay an attorney fee, a victim witness fee, a probation fee. You got to pay a fee for everything. I tell them, I said, look, crime pays. Everybody except you get paid. Everybody except you, and you pay if you're behind the walls or you're going through the penal system. You pay with pain, misery, loneliness, and despair. But everybody else is the lawyers paid, the court officers paid, the district. Everybody gets paid off of our misery, off of our mistakes, and so we got to stop falling into that vicious cycle.
Exactly.
We got to break that chain. Break the chain, if not for ourselves, for our seeds.
So that's all the time we have today. Thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
I appreciate it.
Thanks.
And we'll see you guys next time, same station, same time. Good night.